Hello and welcome to the second review of Request Month 2021. This is Jazzpunk for PC, Mac, Linux, and PlayStation 4, and what you're seeing here is of course the PC version. And this review is coming to you courtesy of Liberty Prime, who sent me a copy of this to take a look at. Thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. While Jazzpunk is generally considered an adventure game, I'd go so far as to say it's a multi-genre but mostly walking simulator kind of thing that was developed by Necrophone Games and published by Adult Swim Games in 2014 for PC, Mac, and Linux, following 2 years later on PS4. It went on to be pretty decently received overall, although most of the reviews when it originally released put it squarely in that slightly above average domain. And that didn't change much when the game released on PlayStation 4 2 years later and was the new Director's Cut version of the game, which includes some extra content, and they did actually bring that to PC as a free update for Jazzpunk, and that's actually what you're seeing in this video. Now of course, before I go any further, it is worth mentioning that even though I don't cover them all that much on the channel, just because I'm usually busy with other games, adventure games are actually one of my primary three genres, the other two being first-person shooters and role-playing games. And with me also enjoying the living crap out of espionage thrillers and even comedies based on things like that, a game like Jazzpunk is actually something that should be right up my alley. So let's just go ahead and start delving right into this and see what exactly we're dealing with here. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the Unity engine, and while Unity does have a bit of a reputation among indie developers, they actually did a pretty good job with everything here. This game is not going for visual fidelity, it is clearly going for aesthetics over everything else, and that does pay off quite well. While you're not going to be getting any sort of high fidelity textures or impressive particle or special effects or anything like that, what you are going to get is a bright, colorful, and cartoony game that has a bit of a retro future aesthetic going on, and also has a fairly unique art style that I've really only seen with a couple of other games. Thing is, the visual style in this isn't necessarily impressive, and it's going to be a very your mileage may vary situation, because there's not much in the way of animations, and the quirkiness of the art style itself is just going to be a bit polarizing to some people. I did, however, run into two specific problems that are a bit more universal. The first of them is that while the game does have an FOV slider, it doesn't give you any numerical values when you're moving the slider along, so you just have to guess. And the FOV itself broke at a certain point when I went into one of the mini games that's present in the game, and suddenly my field of view dropped from well over 100 to about 50. And while I was able to fix it by going back into the menu and readjusting the FOV, suddenly dropping your FOV from a high value to a low value, or going from a low value to a high value in a very rapid succession, will induce heavy nausea. I nearly vomited playing this game because of that. It took me well over half an hour to recover from it. Now thankfully, that was a glitch. It's not the game behaving as intended, so there is that, but it is still something I felt I should mention. The other thing I felt I should mention is the opening sequence of the game, which features a ton of very bright flashing colors that may actually cause some problems for people who have epilepsy, because it actually gave me a headache sitting through that sequence, and I don't have epilepsy, so I can only imagine how it would be for them. So when you bring all of that together, you end up with visuals that are definitely a bit striking and have a pretty unique art style for the most part, although that is going to be rather polarizing, and there are a couple of issues with it here and there. But what about the sound design? Well, that's where things get a bit messier. The sound effects themselves are all of the it works and that's all it needs to do variety, because this is a comedy game. It doesn't need to worry about big, beefy, concussive gun sounds or anything like that. It needs to worry more about quirky and goofy sound effects, which it has, so there's nothing to worry about there. What it does need to worry about, on the other hand, are the voice acting and the music. I say this because the music is barely existent in the game, although what does exist is definitely styled after those kind of classic spy TV shows and movies from the 60s and so, and it does have its cheesy charm about it, but unfortunately, a lot of those tracks are just very short loops that get extremely repetitive and actually kind of annoying pretty quickly. And that's certainly not helped by the fact that the music is given to you in the form of sound emitters placed around the various maps. maps, so you'll get closer to certain objects, and it'll start playing that music much louder, and the further you get away from it, the less audible it becomes until you can't hear it at all. In theory, that's not really a problem. I mean, think about games like, say, Duke Nukem 3D, where you'll go into the strip club, and it will be playing that strip club music only while you're in there, and if you go elsewhere, you're not hearing it. That makes sense in a situation like that. But in Jazzpunk, on the other hand, since the tracks themselves are pretty generic, bland, and at times kind of annoying, it just tends to make things worse. But then there's the voice acting, and for this you have to understand that the development studio behind this game is basically two people. And while they did get a couple of other people to have certain cameos in the game, there's not really much variety. You just end up with a bunch of characters that are heavily pitch-shifted versions of the same person doing the voice. And while you may not necessarily think that's a problem in a game like this, because, haha, funny pitch-shifted voices, unfortunately, a comedy game, and in fact comedies in general, require better voice acting or outright acting than other genres do. Because you are relying on that voice or the acting, or both in some cases, to sell the jokes, and that simply doesn't happen in Jazzpunk. I mean, look, don't get me wrong, I understand that the development studio is basically two people, so they didn't exactly have a pool of people to choose from, but when the results are that you got one guy doing the voices for pretty much all the characters in the game, and then a couple of cameos from figures like Zoe Quinn and Jim Sterling,
shall we say, unfoundry favours for the inhabitants of these most tropical of premises. I was perhaps pontificating whether you'd be so kind as to assist me in one of my, flagrant indulgences.
You're not really getting much out of that. So when you bring all of the presentation together, the rather quirky aesthetic is really doing all of the heavy lifting, and everything else just doesn't really work all that well. But here's the thing, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Agent Polyblank, as he is sent on various missions for a strange espionage agency. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, this game doesn't really have a storyline as much as it has a bunch of completely unconnected jokes that the developers tried to put some vague sense of context in, and then pretty much gave up on, so they just decided to make the entire game an absurd romp. I mean, to give you an idea, the game starts off with you being shipped to the espionage agency in that suitcase, and then you are immediately given a mission to go find a data cartridge by infiltrating the Soviet consulate. And as you're wandering around the area trying to explore and figure out what you need to do, you'll be running into some side activities that will send you on completely nonsensical quests like degaussing carrier pigeons. And as you continue to get further into the game, the things you're doing end up getting weirder, and the interactions you start having with people end up being more bizarre, until eventually the game basically runs out of jokes, so it wraps things up and you end up with a credit sequence that basically leaves things open for something else. Along the way, you'll be running into quite a few pop culture references and obvious parodies of things like, say, Wedding Cake, which is a parody of Quake that is centered around marriage. And so instead of deathmatching with rocket launchers and lightning guns and such, you're using wedding cakes and rose launchers and champagne corks. And you'll also see plenty of references to movies and obvious parodies of Randy Savage and things like that. And while some of these jokes are fairly funny ideas, the problem is that I didn't laugh once the entire time I played this. You may think, oh, that's because DW is a soulless machine or something like that, but no, I do find things funny. The problem is the delivery in Jazzpunk is just not sufficient for making the jokes funny. You may not really understand this if you haven't tried to make something comedic yourself, but comedic delivery is extremely difficult to get right. If you throw a bunch of OMG so random humor into a game like they tried to do with Jazzpunk, it just ends up coming across as incredibly forced, and it just ends up not being funny. Oh sure, don't get me wrong, the game is bizarre, and you'll be sitting there going, wait, what? An awful lot of times, But absolutely none of it has any lasting impact, and it's almost guaranteed to not make you laugh. You might get, at absolute most, a light chuckle out of something. I mean, don't get me wrong, I wasn't expecting every single joke in this game to be outright hilarious or anything, but for a comedy game, I was expecting to at least laugh once. And that didn't even happen. In fact, I barely chuckled at anything throughout the entire game. The only thing I can think of that I actually chuckled at was the wrestling match against the Randy Savage stand-in. So that was one joke. In a game that is completely full of jokes and predicates its entire experience on those jokes. Needless to say, that's a problem, especially when you start to factor in the gameplay, because this game doesn't really have cohesive gameplay. I say that because while most of the game has you walking around or maybe jumping around and clicking on things or interacting with them using the key that you have bound to it on your keyboard, you'll often find yourself messing around with bizarre minigames that have absolutely nothing to do with anything else and only pop up for that one moment so you can have that particular joke. For example, there's a moment where the game turns into Frogger. And there's a moment where the game turns into some sort of zombie thing, but with pizza instead of zombies. And you have to fight off the pizza zombie horde using a peel, which is that long paddle that they use on pizza ovens, and a pizza cutting wheel. There's that wedding cake thing I mentioned earlier, which is basically just a really bad facsimile of Quake Deathmatch, but wedding themed. And of course, there is the wrestling match against the Randy Savage stand-in, which basically turns the game into a first-person fighting game. And then later on in the game, there's mini-golf, but you're playing it with a pool cue, and then there's a gravy race, where you are basically driving an RC boat, only it's a gravy boat, and you're doing it, and look, have I made my point yet? The game doesn't really have coherent gameplay. It has a bunch of jokes that you go between, and you just interact with things with whatever random items it gives you at any given moment in order to eventually get through something. And then some of the jokes don't even really make any sense. For example, there's one point where it starts giving you a bowling joke, and I'm thinking, okay, well I need to go find a bowling ball to roll through these guys. And that's not what you do at all. You get a fly swatter instead, because that makes sense for a bowling joke. Here we are back to the OMG, so random, isn't that funny? No, but that's beside the point. The gameplay part of that is just not enjoyable. The entire gameplay loop of this game is just a mess. There's nothing coherent about it. It's just interacting with random things in random ways until eventually some bizarre thing happens. And that's just not funny, and it's not fun. And it just makes the game drag on and on and on, which is an interesting thing to say considering that it's a 2-hour-long game. I mean, I'd hesitate to even call it an adventure game at all, except that it does actually have puzzles. They're just as ridiculous and nonsensical as all of the other tasks you're doing, but they're usually extremely straightforward and require absolutely no thought whatsoever. It's just go around, find something, and then stick it on something else. Congratulations, you've solved the puzzle. Hell, half the time the game outright tells you what you need to do without you even needing to consult the so-called hint system that's in there. And if you don't want to use said hint system, then frankly you can just wander around and eventually you'll figure out what you need to do anyway, because you'll just start interacting with everything because that's what they intend for you to do, and you just end up getting lost in a sea of completely unfunny jokes. Not necessarily because the jokes themselves aren't funny, but because they're delivered so poorly that they just end up not being funny in this particular instance. And the end result of all this is that you're left with a vapid experience. It has basically no meat at all in the gameplay department, and when you go over to the writing side of things, it might as well just be a 2-hour-long YouTube poop that was very poorly put together and is just not funny. As a result, I give this a 1.5 out of 5. Obviously, your mileage is going to vary depending on how you view the humor in this game. Some people think that OMG So Random humor is the funniest thing in the universe, and they might be able to enjoy this. But anybody else, you might as well just go play something else instead. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to, or you don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for bearing with me as I've had to quickly swap around things on the schedule so I can actually get videos done in a timely manner, or timely-ish manner, I should say, because that's just how life is sometimes. But here we are. Got it done. We're moving on to the third review of Request Month 2021 next week, and I will see you all in later videos.